Following my video about the false rape accuser, Sarah Parkinson, so many people have contacted me with tales of women behaving appallingly. I've seen photos of knife wounds from violent wives, heard from a mother whose son committed suicide following false violence accusations. I've heard stories of mothers using their children in endless family court battles. And here's Gillette telling us it's men who are brutal and vicious. Obviously, I'm not saying that most women behave like that, but the truth is neither gender has a monopoly on vice or virtue. And while our cultural dialogue resounds with women condemning men for their bad behaviour, it's really rare that men dare publicly voice complaints about the way women behave. Now, Jordan Peterson is visiting Australia next week, which reminded me of his first visit here almost a year ago. I just started making YouTube videos when I heard I was going to be MC at a couple of his events and would be able to interview him. I rather nervously prepared for the event with the great man, very aware of how much I admired his knowledge and intellect and courage over so many issues. One of the few areas I took issue with him was his willingness to push men to step up and act responsibly, to take up their load, when he so rarely calls out women over their deficiencies or bad behaviour. But this was actually just after the famous Cathy Newman interview, which taught me I'd be crazy to take him on. So what ended up happening in my interview with him was I made various comments about women behaving badly, which seemed to give him license to be a little bit more outspoken about women's inappropriate behaviour. Here's a classic example where I suggested he's wrong in thinking that women aren't exercising their newfound power.
Well, you know, we don't necessarily understand yet how women would legislate behavior if they actually had full legal and political power, right? Because they haven't, as women, they haven't never had that power. There have been plenty of powerful individual women, but we've never set up a society where the bulk of the legislative decisions were going to be made by women. We don't know what female tyranny would look like, for example. Maybe there'd be an unbelievable regulation of male sexual behavior.
I think we see female tyranny now.
You think you see it starting?
No question.
Yeah, but I don't think we've seen the full manifestation of it yet.
Well, I think we're doing pretty well.
On that one, he clearly wasn't convinced. But better examples when I raised the growing numbers of women who now think it's just fine to deny men any sex in their marriages. Up to that time, Peterson had made a few vague comments about sexual obligation in marriage. But here I pushed the issue a bit more and he went a lot further.
Men always say to me, how do I know I pick a woman who will see this as part of the marriage contract, as you were saying, and as it used to be? Because plenty of women now just shut up shop if they're not interested. I don't know, is that something you've encountered in your clinical work?
Sure, yeah. And it's not obvious what the solution to that is. I mean, you know, to me, those things, because I'm a psychologist, I suppose, those things are best dealt with on a case-by-case basis. You know, if I was talking to a couple, I'm not a couples therapist, but if I was talking to a couple, I would say, well, like, what's the deal here exactly? It's like, what's the minimum? This is something every couple needs to ask. What's the minimum requirement for sexual intimacy in your relationship? 0? No, wrong. That's not. You're going to be torturing each other to death over that. So yes, you can say 0, but believe me, there's a price to be paid for that. Well, I'm willing to pay the price. It's like, okay, well, no problem. Say, well, what's the minimal requirement? My sense with couples is that if they're not intimate, something approximating 1 to 2 times a week at a bare minimum, with an accompanying 90 minutes of conversation about their ongoing marital relationship, like their life, that they drift apart and then they start to go to war with one another. And then they develop stress-related illnesses and get old fast and bitter.
So he's willing to spell out pretty clearly the risks of one side refusing sex in a marriage. But what Peterson won't say is it's usually the woman who's happy with 0 sex. He always treads very carefully about not blaming women for anything. Yet Peterson does sometimes challenge the feminist orthodoxy, such as his famous comment in the Vice interview, where he's talking about sexual harassment and points out women wear lipstick and heels for a reason. But he's still very careful to frame his answers generally, rather than naming women's manipulative behaviour. Here's our exchange about that lipstick comment.
Now, one of the things that fascinated me was that Vice interview where you talked about women wearing high heels and lipstick. And what I thought was extraordinary was the reaction of your interviewer, who was clearly gobsmacked at the idea, your concept that this had something to do with being sexually provocative.
I was putting out a proposition, which is what you do when you think. It's like, here's a possibility, it's an abstraction, why don't we discuss this? That doesn't mean it's real, it doesn't mean it's going to be implemented. I mean, it's very hard for people to do that because people tend to react when you're thinking about something abstractly as if reality itself is at stake, which you can't really do if you're going to think, because you have to consider a wide range of possibilities and weigh them. And so that's what I was doing in that interview. I was putting forward a question. It's like, well, if we're going to regulate sexual behavior in the workplace, which we apparently are hell-bent on doing, then fair enough. Where's your boundaries exactly? To what degree are we going to regulate it? And I don't mean vaguely. I mean exactly how are we going to regulate it? And so the idea that makeup is a sexual display, I just thought that was absolutely self-evident. But it's amazing what isn't self-evident. Now, that also doesn't mean that I don't think women should wear makeup in the workplace. I never said I did think that. I said that if we were going to regulate sexual behavior, that might be one of the things that falls under consideration.
But I wonder whether you'd take it a step further and say we need to look at women's responsibility for their behaviour, not just how they look, but whether they choose to leave a button undone on their shirt, or whether they choose to behave in a sexually provocative way in the workplace.
Well, the boundaries aren't so clear, right?
No.
The boundary between presenting yourself attractively and presenting yourself sexually aren't crystal clear. I mean, sophisticated people know how to play exactly with the edge, I would say, right? Because the more sophisticated you are, the more you can play at edges like that. But to think it through is an absolutely daunting endeavor. Like, okay, what are the rules for how you should dress? It's like, well, you don't know the rules. Just maybe if you know how to dress, you have enough sense so that you have what would you call it? You have an implicit sense of what's appropriate and what isn't. It's part of a very well-developed sense of fashion, let's say. Try to break that down into a set of rules. It's good luck to you, man. That's impossible.
Peterson is a wily character and wasn't going to be pushed into going anywhere he didn't want to go. And as an academic who spent much of his working life surrounded by feminists, he's learned to be very cautious about calling out women's misbehaviour. I confronted a similar mindset in another interview, this time with Australian Josh Zepps, who has a podcast called We the People. I think that podcast was actually really worth listening to because it ranged over a wide range of issues, and Zepps is really smart. He's a clever interviewer who's well known for listening carefully and welcoming diverse views. However, he's also a self-confessed lefty. He presents occasionally on ABC Radio, which should tell you everything about him. Naturally, he's surrounded there by women who feed him the usual feminist claptrap on the sort of issues I talk about. He introduces my podcast sounding almost apologetic for including my interview in his series. He stresses so many times how controversial I was. Speaking to him, I was very conscious that he was being exposed to views he'd rarely heard voiced, like my talk about the fake rape crisis at our universities and the way feminist activists are shutting down debate on female sexual responsibility. He's really challenging and sceptical at the start of the long interview, but as it progresses, he ends up supporting many of my arguments. I actually think he found himself surprised to be agreeing with me on issues which I'm sure would have had his feminist listeners grinding their teeth. So here we're talking about whether no always does mean no, and I refer to the hugely popular romance novels, which often include themes of reluctant women being seduced into sex. Zepps bravely responds with a story that supports my argument. They think they have to play games and not say yes initially, and they want him to break down their resistance. Have you ever looked at there's a whole genre of chick lit stuff, the bodice rippers, the romance novels, which are all about women. One of the major themes is women saying, no, 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 and then yes, 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 when he pushes through that resistance.
It's funny. It's funny you say that, because I was on a plane not long ago, and there was a Pepe Le Pew cartoon on the in-flight entertainment, and I was watching Pepe Le Pew, going, "Wow, he is a rapist by modern day standards." Right? There's a cat with an actor who accidentally looks like a skunk who's running away, and Pepe Le Pew is pursuing, and it's all done in the fun of like French romance, but. Yeah, you're right that there is a cultural trope that up until 3 seconds ago in cultural time has been regarded as uncontroversial, which is that women sometimes play a coquettish type who isn't interested in sex and wants to be pursued, and the male Lothario pursues them with ever greater gestures of romance.
I was talking about how feminists are shutting down any proper debate on female responsibility for putting themselves into situations where they take sexual risks. Here too, Zepps ends up adding his own story, which is supporting my point. There was one of our universities, the University of Canberra, had a party safe page on their website, which had a perfectly sensible statement, which was something like, if you drink too much or take too many drugs, you might end up doing things you didn't really mean to do. And the feminist activists on that campus demanded the universities take that down, because you're not allowed to talk about don't get raped. You're only allowed to talk about don't rape.
I was presenting the breakfast program on ABC Radio Sydney over the summer, so it must have been maybe in January or February, the southern summer. And the New South Wales Police media tweeted out some cute, I think it was Beyonce lyrics that had been modified into a "Be Safe at Night, Girls" type of slogan that involved advice like make sure that a friend knows where you're going, dress sensibly, take care of yourself, don't lose your head on booze and drugs. And they got in horrible hot water because the implication was that the police force was blaming women for being raped, when in actual fact you would think that everything there was completely unobjectionable about just being exactly what I will want to tell my daughter when she's older than one about what to do to keep herself safe.
Here's another example where I'm talking about feminism dictating to us that we aren't allowed to enjoy flirting or sexual banter. Women going into male workplaces, male factories, and saying men aren't allowed to have sexy calendars on the doors, or, men aren't allowed to talk to us in that sort of way, when in fact plenty of women enjoyed being related to in that way. I mean, this is what's really bugging me about all this constant wagging their finger at men, this female assumption of moral superiority, and the fact that it is going against the way the majority of the population would like to behave towards each other.
Do you think that is a majority? Do you think there's a silent majority of women who feel that this is all a little bit ridiculous and that they'd like the flattery of having someone, I don't know, wolf whistle at them on the street or tell them that they have a nice ass?
Absolutely. Have you been to Italy recently? I mean, it's still there. In some cultures, it's still well and truly there, and you'll find jokey little travel articles from women writers saying, oh, it was so nice to have men relate to me in that way, because men have been totally shut down in America or Australia. It was funny for me at that time because I sensed when it started to occur to him that maybe most people have a different view on these issues from the one prescribed by his feminist buddies. And here he is, getting positively brave.
One of the things that's happened to the conversation in Me Too that I'm struggling with, or that I don't quite know how to articulate, is it always the case that bringing to the courtship realm things that aren't just your looks are out of bounds? Because that's what seems to be being implied, that if you're an old ugly guy, then to play your cards of status and wealth is creepy, unacceptable, misogynistic, semi-sexual assault. But if you're a young stud or a beautiful young woman, then those are the only cards that it's kosher to play.
Yeah. Look, there's total hypocrisy in that we talk, as you say, we talk about men's sources of power and, call them out if they misuse them, and we're no longer allowed to discuss it all the way women manipulate situations or take advantage of situations through using their assets, and being young and attractive is certainly one of them. So confronted with a woman telling it as it is, Josh Zepps ended up responding honestly, giving his own examples of women's confusing behaviour. Jordan Peterson was far more cautious. Both of these men are from leftist cultures, academia and the ABC, where they've been trained to be very, very nervous of blotting their copybook with the feminists. Conservative men are equally reluctant to call out women's bad behaviour, but for different reasons. Here the problem is chivalry, old-fashioned adherence to the gynocentric ideal of women on a pedestal whose virtue no gentleman would challenge. This form of benevolent sexism exploits men's culturally imposed desire to protect and show reverence for women. And that makes it damn hard to acknowledge that women can be very, very bad. Andrew Bolt on Sky News is a classic example. Watch him struggle to cope when I tell him I'm not surprised men are choosing to steer clear of women now that we're showing our true evil colours.
And I'm not surprised we're seeing men going their own way. We're seeing a lot of men making the decision to stay away from us because we've proved how dangerous we are. And I'm really ashamed of women at the moment. We're showing ourselves in the worst possible light, I think. And it's no wonder men are very nervous.
Men are very nervous. Oh, well, look, thank heavens that some of us still know that marriage is not such a done deal for us personally, although, my goodness, if it goes out of fashion, how sad I feel for the upcoming generation.
And very sad for children. I mean, because you're most important.
Yes.
That's pretty funny, isn't it? It's a fascinating business being out in public talking about wicked women, with predictable reactions from feminists, but plenty of support from ordinary women. There's a constant stream of men telling me they agree with me, but wouldn't dare voice such opinions even in their own social group. It's frightening how men have been cowed and now just keep their heads down and endure the constant attacks. So this is a call to arms, encouraging other women to get more vocal. We need to be bold and talk openly about how some women are behaving and expose the cover-ups that deny women's role in family violence, their blatant disregard for the truth on any number of issues, from why boys are doing badly in schools to the fake rape crisis, cancer funding, harassment in the workplace. It's true it's far easier for women than men to call out feminist lies and get their message heard. Women speaking out will help men start to defend themselves, but in the end, they too need to take on this battle. I just had an email today from an old friend, a psychology professor, who was talking about the American Psychological Association's appalling new guidelines on toxic masculinity. He told me he was going to tweet something about him, but his friends managed to discourage him from doing that. I put a bomb under him, telling him that most people, most psychologists, know this is all feminist rubbish, but the only reason the APA gets away with publishing it is that the sensible majority remains silent. We all, men and women, have to step up and take them on.